The Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's triumph, Hood's gamble, and McPherson's tragic fall. By mid-1864, the war was dragging on, and the North was getting weary. Abraham Lincoln's re-election was on the horizon, and things were looking grim. If the Union couldn't turn the tide and deliver a decisive victory soon, there was a real chance Lincoln might lose. And with it, the hope of preserving the Union might die too. Enter General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man known for his intensity, daring tactics, and unapologetic view of total war. Sherman had been tasked with capturing Atlanta, a vital Confederate stronghold. A victory here would cripple the Confederacy's ability to continue the war and boost Lincoln's chances at the polls. Facing him on the other side was General John Bell Hood, a brash and aggressive Confederate leader, newly appointed to command the Army of Tennessee. Hood was a man with a lot to prove, particularly after his predecessor, General Joseph Johnston, had been removed for what President Jefferson Davis saw as an overly cautious defense of Atlanta. Johnston had a reputation for being careful, but Hood was his opposite, impatient, bold, and willing to gamble. The Confederate leadership believed Hood's aggressive style might be exactly what was needed to drive Sherman back. But in hindsight, this appointment might have been the first in a series of miscalculations that led to the South's defeat in this battle. By early 1864, the Civil War had been raging for nearly 3 grueling years. The Union had seen some big victories, most notably, Ulysses S. Grant's capture of Vicksburg, which effectively split the Confederacy in two like a knife through butter. Grant, now the top dog of all Union forces, had earned his stripes by proving he wasn't afraid to dig in, take heavy losses, and come out swinging. And standing right next to him in both strategy and friendship was none other than General William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, Sherman wasn't your run-of-the-mill general. He was a man with a peculiar mix of brilliance and eccentricity. Born in Ohio to a family of 11 children, he was named after the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, because, apparently, the Shermans wanted their boy to be a warrior from the start. After his father died, young Sherman was taken in by Senator Thomas Ewing, whose daughter he would later marry. Sherman, it seems, was always a man of unusual fate. Military life suited him well, though he had his ups and downs. He had served with distinction during the Mexican-American War, but during the early years of the Civil War, Sherman experienced a mental breakdown and was deemed insane by the press. He came back stronger, though, proving that you can knock him down, but you can't knock him out. By 1864, Sherman had a reputation for being a logistical genius, with a vision that stretched far beyond the next battle. He saw war in totality, and he knew that to break the South, it wasn't enough to win battles. The South had to be dismantled piece by piece. And that's where Atlanta came in. On the other side was General Joseph E. Johnston, a Southern gentleman with a knack for defensive warfare. Born in Virginia to a respectable family, Johnston had been educated at West Point and served in the Mexican-American War alongside many of his Civil War contemporaries. He wasn't one to shy away from a fight, but Johnston had a cautious streak, often more interested in preserving his army than risking it all on a single, catastrophic battle. This trait would earn him praise from some and scorn from others, especially the Confederate leadership, who were itching for a win. Johnston had been tasked with defending Atlanta, the industrial heart of the Confederacy. Losing Atlanta would be a body blow that the South might not recover from. But Johnston, ever the pragmatist, wasn't about to charge headlong into Sherman's 100,000-strong army. Instead, his strategy was simple: retreat, fortify, fight when necessary, and make Sherman's life as difficult as possible. So, in May of 1864, the stage was set. Sherman, now commander of the Military Division of the Mississippi, had over 100,000 troops under his command. His orders? Simple: break the Confederate defenses, capture Atlanta, and destroy the South's ability to wage war. And with his cigar firmly clenched between his teeth, Sherman began the march from Chattanooga, Tennessee, toward Georgia. But Sherman wasn't looking for one massive battle to end it all. Oh no, that would be too easy, and Sherman wasn't interested in easy. He was a man who understood the art of pressure, slow, steady pressure that would squeeze the life out of the Confederacy. His strategy was brilliant, almost like a game of chess on a battlefield. Rather than meet Johnston head-on, he would outflank him, force him to retreat, and do it all over again, each time pushing Johnston's army further and further south. The first real encounter came at Resaca, Georgia, in mid-May. Johnston had taken a strong defensive position, and Sherman, with a devilish grin no doubt, decided it was time to test just how well the Confederates could hold up. The battle started like most Civil War battles: cannon fire, musket shots, and thousands of men screaming across open fields. But it wasn't long before Sherman decided to do what he did best: outmaneuver. While his forces engaged Johnston's men head-on, Sherman sent part of his army across the Oostenaula River to cut off the Confederate supply line. Johnston, realizing that Sherman was about to choke him out, did what he had to do. He ordered a retreat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Sherman, on the other hand, pressed forward, knowing that this retreat was just the beginning. The chess game was far from over. A few weeks later, the two armies clashed again at New Hope Church. By this point, Johnston had pulled his army back and dug in, determined to make Sherman fight for every inch of ground. Sherman, however, wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He launched an assault, believing that he could break through Johnston's lines with brute force. It didn't go well. The Confederates were dug in so deep, it was like trying to punch through a brick wall. Sherman's troops took heavy losses, and for the first time in the campaign, it seemed like Johnston had found a way to slow down the Union juggernaut. But if there was one thing Sherman was good at, it was learning from his mistakes. Rather than waste more men on a frontal assault, he simply moved his forces around Johnston's flank, forcing the Confederates to retreat yet again. Next came the infamous Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. This time, Sherman's luck ran out. Convinced that Johnston's lines were vulnerable, he ordered a direct assault on the Confederate positions at Kennesaw Mountain in late June. It was a disaster. The Union forces were mowed down by Confederate rifle fire, and the attack ended in one of Sherman's rare but humbling defeats. Still, Sherman wasn't one to dwell on failure. "I'll try him again tomorrow," he famously quipped, his optimism undeterred. Sure enough, rather than continue the bloodbath, Sherman did what he always did. He flanked Johnston once again, and the Confederates were forced to fall back toward Atlanta. As the summer of 1864 heated up, both literally and figuratively, General William Tecumseh Sherman and his Union forces were on a slow, grinding march through northern Georgia, and the Confederates could feel the pressure. The thick, humid air made everything harder. Sherman's troops, a mix of grizzled veterans and green recruits, sloshed through mud, battled mosquitoes, and hacked their way through the rough Georgia wilderness. But what kept them moving was Sherman himself, a man of seemingly endless energy. He would ride along the lines, barking orders, plotting strategy, and always thinking ahead to his prize, Atlanta. As Sherman's army advanced, tensions boiled over not just on the battlefield but behind the scenes in Richmond, Virginia, where the Confederate High Command was engaged in a far more diplomatic duel. At the center of it was Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, known for his cautious, and some would say overly cautious, strategy of retreating in the face of Sherman's superior numbers. Johnston's idea was to stretch the Union supply lines thin, make Sherman chase after him, and wait for the right moment to strike. But patience was not something Confederate President Jefferson Davis was known for. Davis had long been frustrated with Johnston, muttering, "Retreat, retreat, where's the fight?" Finally, on July 17, 1864, Davis had enough. With the Confederacy's heartland under siege, Davis made a decision that would shape the fate of the Atlanta campaign. He replaced Johnston with a fiery, aggressive general by the name of John Bell Hood. Hood was a different beast altogether. Where Johnston was cautious, Hood was a man of bold action, even reckless at times. He was a Texas-born fighter who'd already sacrificed much for the Confederate cause. He'd lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and had a leg amputated after the Battle of Chickamauga. Despite his physical limitations, Hood was ferocious, a man who believed in fighting head-on. And Sherman, upon hearing of Hood's promotion, smiled slyly and reportedly quipped, "Hood will come out and fight." Sherman knew what was coming. Hood wouldn't retreat like Johnston, he would attack. But was replacing Johnston with Hood a good idea? As it turns out, Hood's aggression would prove both a blessing and a curse for the Confederate defense of Atlanta. In hindsight, it may have been one of the South's greatest miscalculations. By late July 1864, Sherman's forces were bearing down on Atlanta. But Hood had a trick up his sleeve. On July 22, just days after taking command, Hood launched a massive counterattack in a last-ditch effort to catch Sherman off guard. He wanted to do something Johnston would never dare: throw his men into the jaws of the Union Army and try to crush Sherman's left flank with a surprise assault. The stakes couldn't be higher. On the evening of July 21, Hood called a meeting with his top officers, his face set in grim determination. "Gentlemen," he said, leaning on his cane, "we're going to hit Sherman where he least expects it." The plan was audacious, classic Hood. He was convinced that a surprise attack could cripple Sherman's army and save Atlanta. Hood's plan was to sneak his forces around Sherman's flank during the night, a daring 15-mile march through rugged terrain. If everything went perfectly, Hood would catch the Union forces by surprise and drive them back, forcing Sherman to retreat from Atlanta altogether. But here's the thing about bold plans: they rely on everything going perfectly. Spoiler alert, nothing went perfectly. The Confederates slogged through the night, but the march took longer than expected. Hood's men were exhausted by the time they arrived at their positions, and coordination between Confederate units broke down. Instead of a cohesive surprise attack, what followed was more of a chaotic scramble. And to make matters worse for Hood, his movements hadn't gone unnoticed. Major General James McPherson, one of Sherman's most trusted commanders, had a sharp eye. Riding near the front lines, he noticed something strange, a Confederate buildup that suggested an attack was imminent. McPherson rushed back to Sherman and warned him of Hood's intentions, giving the Union forces just enough time to dig in and prepare for the onslaught. As McPherson rode to the front to check on his men, tragedy struck. Riding into a wooded area, McPherson stumbled right into a group of Confederate skirmishers. They demanded his surrender, but McPherson, loyal to the end, turned his horse to escape. The sound of a single gunshot rang out, and the Union's rising star was gone, killed instantly. News of McPherson's death spread like wildfire through the Union ranks, devastating Sherman, who described him as a man of rare promise. Sherman was visibly shaken by the loss of his friend and commander. But the battle raged on. Hood's attack hit the Union lines like a hammer, but it was met with steel. Sherman's men, braced for the attack, held their ground fiercely. The Confederate assaults were brave, but they were also disorganized and poorly timed. Waves of Confederate soldiers charged at Union fortifications, only to be repelled again and again. The battlefield soon turned into a scene of horror, muskets cracking, cannons booming, men falling left and right. By the end of the day, the Confederates had been beaten back with heavy losses. Over 8,000 Confederate soldiers lay dead or wounded, compared to 3,700 Union casualties. Hood had gambled and lost. Sherman was now closer than ever to Atlanta. Sherman, standing amid the chaos of the battlefield, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "I told you Hood would come out and fight," he said to one of his officers with a wry grin. He just didn't know he was walking into his own funeral. Inside the city, Atlanta's civilians were living through a nightmare. As the Union Army encircled the city, bombardments became a daily occurrence. Cannonballs and shells whistled overhead, crashing into homes and businesses. Civilians, including women, children, and enslaved black people, huddled together in basements and cellars, praying for the storm to pass. The Union bombardment was relentless, and the city was in turmoil. As Hood regrouped his battered forces within the defenses of Atlanta, Sherman prepared for his next move. He wasn't about to let Hood lick his wounds in peace. Knowing that a direct assault on Atlanta would be costly, Sherman devised a plan to strike the city from a different angle. In a bold move, Sherman ordered his troops to swing around to the west, effectively bypassing Hood's main defenses. It was a classic Sherman maneuver, brilliant, unexpected, and devastating. While Hood scrambled to react, Sherman's forces stormed the city's supply lines and railroads, cutting off Atlanta's lifeblood. As word of Sherman's flanking attack reached Hood, the Confederate general could only stare in disbelief. "Damn that Sherman!" Hood reportedly exclaimed. "He's like a ghost, always where I don't expect him." By early September, Hood realized that he could no longer hold Atlanta. With his army battered and his supply line severed, he made the painful decision to abandon the city. On September 1st, Confederate forces set fire to military installations as they evacuated, and by the next day, Sherman's troops marched triumphantly into Atlanta. Sherman sent a succinct message to Washington: "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." The news electrified the North and gave President Lincoln the boost he desperately needed for his re-election campaign. Meanwhile, Hood's career took a sharp downward turn. His defense of Atlanta had been valiant, but ultimately futile. Sherman's relentless march had proven unstoppable, and Hood's aggressive tactics had only hastened his downfall. As for Sherman, he spent the next few weeks consolidating his hold on Atlanta. Union soldiers celebrated their victory with a mock parliament, debating the new Constitution of the South over campfires and barrels of whiskey. Sherman himself was less interested in political debates and more focused on his next move. He had already set his sights on Savannah. For Hood, the fall of Atlanta marked the beginning of the end. His forces were too depleted to mount a serious defense elsewhere. Sherman, ever the pragmatic general, wasted no time preparing for his next move. Atlanta's fall wasn't just the end of the campaign, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Sherman would soon embark on his infamous March to the Sea, but that, as they say, is another story. The Battle of Atlanta was not just a military engagement, it was a turning point in American history. It shaped the outcome of the Civil War, saved Lincoln's presidency, and brought the nation one step closer to ending the bloody conflict. But more than that, it was a human tragedy. Thousands of men, from both North and South, gave their lives for causes they believed in, and for families they would never see again. As you reflect on this brutal battle, remember the stories of those who fought, loved, and died. They were men of flesh and blood, caught up in a war larger than themselves, where bravery met tragedy and history was forever changed. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling Civil War stories like this one.